Sure.
All right, so I'm Calvin Lynn from UT Austin, and today we have two wonderful speakers. Our first one is Kathleen Fisher, who has a wealth of experiences both in industry and academia and as a program manager at DARPA. And I think you're the chair at Tufts, where one of my former students is. Anyways, I think Kathleen, I'm not going to read the title. Thank you, Kathleen.
My pleasure. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, good. So it's my pleasure to be here today talking about what career choices you have if you decide to do a PhD in computer science. What good is a PhD anyway? So it turns out it's good for quite a lot. So really, if you think about it, what a PhD is saying is that you have the capability of identifying interesting problems that haven't been solved before, that you have had the experience of devising a solution to that unknown problem, that you have successfully evaluated that solution either by doing experimentation or by doing a proof or a case study or user study or you've produced evidence that was successful in convincing your committee, and that you were able to explain that solution in both written and oral form. Right? There's a reason why you have to give a thesis defense orally and then you have to write your thesis. Right? So that set of skills actually is incredibly valuable for many, many different kinds of things. So that's what the certificate, that's what a PhD actually says, the credential. What it does is it kind of changes the kind of jobs that you're qualified for, the kind of jobs that people will hire you for. It doesn't dramatically increase your lifetime earnings opportunity. Right? If your goal in life is to maximize your lifetime earnings, stop with a bachelor's or maybe stop with a master's degree. The opportunity cost of going and spending 5-6 years doing a PhD and getting paid enough to live on, but not a normal competitive computer science salary, you'll never make that up. So if you're in it for the money, you should stop. But the lifestyle change is really very significant. The kind of jobs that you can do as a PhD are quite different than the kind of jobs that you can do if you don't have a PhD. And so that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time today. And please feel free to interrupt and ask questions, and I will do my best to leave time for questions at the end. So when you finish a PhD, one of the things you can do right away is a postdoc. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what a postdoc looks like before going into kind of longer-term career plans. And statistics that the NSF publishes about, in 2016, 30% of the PhDs in math and computer science took academic positions, not including postdocs. So 30%, that's math and computer science. They don't have the data for computer science teased out. So that's like 70% are doing something else. So there's a lot of things you can do besides go become a professor. So postdocs. So in some other fields, like the field my daughter is in, biology, you basically have to do at least one and probably two postdocs. So you're spending somewhere between 3 and 6 years after you finish your PhD doing postdocs. In computer science, you can do a postdoc if you like, but you don't really have to. Typically, a postdoc in computer science would last somewhere between 1 and 3 years. At the moment, they're generally obtained informally through word of mouth. So this is not great for diversity. This is probably like we're here telling you, right? This option exists. If you're interested in doing a postdoc, talk to your advisor, get your advisor to work his or her network to find out what possibilities exist, work your network to figure out what possibilities exist. You basically go talk to people. And the money usually comes from a grant application that your postdoc advisor has. So it's very informal. You should make sure when you're doing this that whatever you're working on is something that would advance your career aspirations as well as the the ties that the money comes with. So it's really important to negotiate your expectations up front about how much of the time that you're spending or working on whatever the source of the money is coming from and how much of the time is spent on whatever project you want to be working on. You should also expect to get mentoring from your postdoc advisor in the same way that you get mentoring from your PhD advisor. And if you don't feel those vibes, don't do that option. You can expect to be paid significantly more than you get paid as a PhD student. To do a postdoc, but also significantly less than anything that you would do otherwise. So it's a building up your experience kind of thing, not building up your bank account kind of a thing. And it's often the case you can apply simultaneously for academic positions and for postdoc, and then you can actually get both. And most, in fact, I think probably all academic institutions at this point who are just really happy to hire anyone would be willing to defer your starting as a faculty member to spend a year on a postdoc. I think this is actually a win all around because it gives you a year when you've finished your thesis, you finished the PhD, to collect yourself as like, what do I want to do in the future? What are my research ideas? What are my vision? And to get started on that so that when you become a professor, you already have a kind of year's thoughts and planning under your belt, and you can get jump started faster as a faculty member. So most departments that I know of support that idea and would be very happy to have you defer for a year. And when economic times are difficult, and there have been times in the past when getting a job in academia with a CS PhD was difficult, there have been more formally structured postdoc programs that the NSF has run. Right now, as far as I can tell, they're not available, but if there was a downturn, I'm sure that those kinds of processes would come back to make sure that people graduating during that downturn would be able to get jobs. Of course, it's really, really hard to imagine right now that there could be such a downturn, but I've lived through 2 of them, so it is, in my memory, it was possible. Okay, so postdocs. So the rest of the story, I'm going to sort of interleave what it's like to be at these different kind of places with my personal journey. I've gone through working in industry, working in government, and now working in academia. So my first stop was going into industry in a research lab. So when I graduated in 1996, the academic job market was bad. So I actually applied for and got a postdoc from NSF, but I also got a permanent position at AT&T Labs, and I decided to take that position at AT&T Labs, partly because it was a permanent job, so that was a really big deal. I really liked working at AT&T Labs. Some of the advantages, you get to do peer research on interesting problems that are relevant to the company. So in academia, you're typically doing research with students, and you don't get to do research with peers so much. Whereas in a research lab, you're doing research with other people who already have a PhD. So you don't have the obligation of simultaneously doing research and training somebody else how to do research, which can be a little bit daunting. So working with a peer takes off one dimension of what you're doing, and you can focus on the research, which is attractive. I certainly liked that part for a long time. Also, companies have like real problems and real data. Sometimes if you're a professor, you're like scratching your head and kind of inventing like you have something you like to do, and then you go imagine like, where might this thing possibly be relevant? And you kind of invent that scenario and then do the work. Whereas companies, it's like, no, they have real problems. And so, you have to do this kind of matchup of like, what do I want to do and how does that relate to what the company wants to do? And that matchup is really important. But they have the real problems and they have access to real data. So like interviewing machine learning candidates these days, one of the things machine learning candidates often say is I have to be very strategic about what kind of problems I work on to make sure that it's a kind of problem I can do in academia as opposed to have to be at Google or Amazon or Facebook where I could get access to enough data to be able to do that work. You can work with students, so it's very common to have summer interns in research labs, and you can teach a little bit if you negotiate with your company to like go teach a class at a local university, so all that's possible. In academia, faculty not only do research and teaching, they also run the department. They do the management part, which many faculty like to despise. I'm personally department chair, so I find that despising a little bit hard, a little bit frustrating. But in a research lab, there's a whole management infrastructure that worries about the management. So you don't have to worry about that part either. And you don't have to worry about the stress of tenure. So like your job is just very focused. You get to work on research that is relevant to the company. You don't have to write grant proposals. So you just really get to focus, which is really, really nice. Disadvantages, your work has to align with the corporate goals, and those corporate goals can shift over time. And so, research goes pretty slowly. Corporate goals can realign really fast, so that can be kind of painful. You don't have PhD students, which over time can be like one of the kinds of legacies you might want to leave as a researcher is your legacy of PhD students, and you don't have PhD students in research lab. And you may or may not be able to publish as freely as you like. So if you're thinking about a research lab position, asking about the publication procedures is a really important question because you as a member of the research community, publishing is actually really, really important. And then over time, the corporate commitment can vary. So when I joined AT&T, they were thinking about, they were going to create a big programming language effort to how you program the network. And they hired me as a theorist to provide semantic validity to that language design process. But between when they hired me in May and when I showed up in August, they decided they didn't want to do that at all. And the people who were in charge
in fact went to Lucent instead of AT&T. So none of them were there either. So like I showed up and no one in my management chain knew really who I was or why or thought at all like that what I did was at all relevant to them. So this is not a good circumstance to be in. So I worked really hard to change kind of as fast as I possibly could from being a type theorist kind of POPL person to being a language design, domain-specific language applied to AT&T kinds of problems. So that worked out, but that realignment was really, really necessary. Research labs typically evaluate employees, researchers, on two dimensions. One is impact to the company, and the other is impact to the outside world. So most people have a combination. Some people are so brilliant on what they do to the outside world, it doesn't matter what they do inside, but that's like winning Turing Award kind of levels. Like Peter Shor at AT&T was in this category, right? He figured out how to factor prime numbers in polynomial time on a quantum computer. The publicity associated with that paid for him like many, many times over. So he didn't have to do anything relevant to the company. There were other people who did stuff that was relevant to the company, that was so relevant that it didn't matter what they did. And of course you don't know who they are because they only did things that was internally relevant to the company. Most people were in between, and that was the place that I was striving to be. It was really important to me to be impactful to the company because I was worried about what happened to my job if I couldn't. But I also really wanted to be visible outside the community because because I care about the outside research community. The other thing is that the stability really can change over time. So when I joined AT&T Labs, I thought, wow, I don't have to worry about all this tenure stuff, like super stressful. My job could go away. Like AT&T AT&T Labs has existed for 100 years, right? What could possibly go wrong? Yeah, exactly. So some people know something went wrong, right? So 3 years into my time at AT&T, they laid off 40% of the research staff, right? So it was a really good thing I had realigned my research to match the corporate goals because when they did that layoff, they didn't lay me off, right? So, and the AT&T has gone through a number of cycles of layoffs and downsizing. And the most recent one, which actually happened after I left, had nothing to do with the bottom line of the company. There was a new vice president for research and development who was like, why are we doing this research crap and just cut it, right? Focused very much on only the research that was very, very clearly very, very short term. So, different research labs have different degrees of stability, and thinking about that stability is something that's a really important thing as you think about taking a job in a research lab. So like job security here is really about being employable at another job that you would like to have. So like when I was talking about how it was really important to me to maintain my outside visibility, part of the reason for that was if I wasn't going to work at AT&T Labs Research, I wanted to be at another research institution, which means I had to be visible as a researcher and had to be publishing so that people at other institutions could see who I was. I also knew that I was interested in being a tenure-track professor, and so while I was at AT&T, I arranged to teach classes at Stanford, like one course a year, so not a huge thing, and co-teaching with a Stanford professor, so there was, it wasn't an overwhelming amount of time, but the most important thing is my name was on the teaching evaluations. So when Tufts eventually came to consider my case for tenure, I could give them teaching evaluations that had my name on it that showed that I was at least as good as, or actually maybe slightly better than, Stanford professor, right? Which Tufts probably discounts the quality of Stanford faculty, but in terms of teaching, right, I did my PhD at Stanford. I'm now at Tufts. So Tufts cares very much about teaching, more about teaching, than most Research One institutions. And so part of the self-worth of the institution is the quality of the teaching. Stanford's self-worth is mostly in the quality of the research, right? Right, so I had those teaching evaluations, and I had written grant applications, not necessarily for me. I didn't need any funding because I was funded by AT&T, but my co-authors could use funding, and I could use a little bit of travel funding. But the experience of writing grant applications meant that when I was moving into academia, I had the credibility that I could actually do that job. Right. So one of the times at AT&T when there was sort of a difficult economic time, a Google headhunter reached out to me to ask if I was interested in moving to Google. And at the time, 3 of my 4, I worked for AT&T Research, my husband worked for AT&T Research, my ex-husband worked for AT&T Research, and his wife was a stay-at-home mom. So 3 out of 4 of the family incomes were at AT&T Research with this, up and down, uncertain situation. So when the Google headhunter called and asked if I was interested in interviewing at Google, I'm like, well, only if you also interview my husband and my ex-husband. And they're like, okay. So in fact, they interviewed all three of us, and they made offers to all three of us, but only my husband took them up on the job. So he did his PhD at MIT with Barbara Liskov in distributed systems. When he went to Google, he actually switched into a development position, right? So his job is no longer to publish papers. His job originally was to make big table work, so make some of the infrastructure at Google work better and faster. He now works on image search. So he really liked that transition. For one, he hates having to do multiple things at the same time. So he can basically focus on exactly one thing at Google. So that was a huge advantage for him. It would have been really boring for me, but he really liked that. You get to work with peers, much better pay, right? So he gets paid twice as much as I do, right? And I'm actually really quite successful as an academic computer scientist. And he gets to have many, many people potentially using his work. The disadvantages is the intellectual contribution is all within Google. And he doesn't really get to publish, or he probably could publish if he tried really hard, but it's not a required part of the job, and so doesn't really publish. And he has less control over what he works on. At Google, actually, there's a range of things you could work on with a PhD. Some of them are very much pure research. Things like in computer vision are pretty much pure research. And then things in like ML, there's some of it is pure ML research and some of it is applied. And then distributed systems, what he worked on, mostly that's applied at Google. And the more pure it is, the more likely you can publish things. The more applied it is, the less likely you can publish things. Right, so developer is one possibility. Another possibility is a startup, right? So there are various people who take their research in computer science and go start a company. So, Google is an obvious example. Of course, Google is not the most common example, just in case you were curious. But, VMware, Grammatech, Galwa, Monoidix, those are all companies that were started by computer science PhD kinds of people. Where what you're doing is commercializing some new idea. It's fast-paced, it's all hands on deck. And it can be really satisfying. It can also be quite stressful, and almost all startups fail, right? So again, the job security is not so much that you're guaranteed that startup job is going to last, but rather the skills that you're learning at the startup would be applicable in lots of other positions. So re-employability is the job security of a startup. And then there's this contract research. So the government actually doesn't do very much research in-house, but it pays academics in industry and academia to do research. So there are a whole bunch of companies of varying sizes. Some of them are very small, like Galwa that has about 70 employees, or maybe 100 now. They've hired 30 people in the last year, up to Lockheed Martin, so enormous defense contractor. There you're doing research that is under the specification of some government agency. You get to work on cutting edge research with peers. You don't have to publish if you don't want to publish, but the profit margins are set by law, and they're pretty narrow. You're not going to become rich doing contract work for the government, and it requires writing lots and lots of proposals like it does in academia, and you're subject to the whims of government budgets and contracting rules. But there are a lot of cool people doing really interesting work in these kinds of positions. Okay, so those are kind of a very fast overview of the kinds of things you can do in industry. Then my daughter went to college, and my 5-body problem converted to a 2-body problem. And that second body was way more flexible than the original second body. And so I actually took the opportunity to finally apply for academic jobs, because I had always wanted to be a professor. When I was a grad student, my model was I wanted to go be a professor, not that I wanted to go work in a research lab. And I figured if I didn't switch then, I was never going to switch, and I might really regret that. So I applied and got the job at Tufts. But because I didn't previously have tenure, I had to go through the full tenure process. Tufts doesn't have an expedited process. So they gave me the job in May, and they gave me tenure in January. So during that very long period, the opportunity to go to DARPA as a program manager came up. I heard Peter Lee speak 3 times about what it was like to be a program manager at DARPA. And the third time, I'm like, okay, you convinced me. Am I the kind of person you're looking for? So what DARPA doesn't do research itself per se. It instead contracts out with academics and people in industry to do research. And the job of a program manager is to identify an opportunity, a place where there's something that's relevant to national security that is not the way it should be, where there's potential to fix it, where the current state of the art is not doing the job, where you have some idea about how to fix it, and you have some basis for confidence. So in my case, I talked about hacking into cars, right? So Stefan Savage and Yoshi Kano had showed that you could remotely hack into a car and take over complete control of whatever the car was doing. I'm that's bad, right? And then I talked about formal methods and SCL4 microkernel and the CompCert verifying C compiler and how we could take that idea and use it on software for vehicles and quadcopters and things like that would make them much harder to hack into. And so I got the job and I started the HackIMS program, which was, I think, eventually funded at about $85 million. I got to publish the BAA and then evaluate the proposals and choose about 10 research groups around the world to work on this problem and then manage what they were doing. At the end of the program, a world-class red team was able to test. They were given root access on a partition on a helicopter and charged with breaking out of that partition and disrupting the operation of the helicopter. And the DARPA was so confident of the success of the formal methods team that they let that red team attack the helicopter while it was in flight with 2 test pilots, right? So, the test pilots are crazy. But those test pilots had more than the usual level of confidence in what they were doing. So everything went well, right? So that's an example of the kind. So there I would say the experience of being a DARPA program manager, so it is kind of like the experience of being a professor. So when you're a grad student, you do your research. You know where all the bits are buried. You know exactly what's going on and where things don't exactly work the way that you would like them to, right? Then you graduate and you maybe take an academic position, and now you're responsible for writing a grant proposal, looking up, seeing kind of the lay of the land, and figuring out where you should go. You get the grant, you then hire grad students, and then you start working towards the direction that you had, and you still are doing the research, but you're doing it kind of with and through your students. So you don't know exactly where all the bits are buried, but you mostly know what's going on. So being a DARPA program manager is like one level up from that, right? Instead of writing a grant proposal, you write a meta grant proposal. Instead of hiring grad students, you hire research labs and professors with their own research groups. And then instead of making sure your grad students have the resources they need and they're playing well and not getting stuck, you're making sure the research organizations are playing well with each other and not getting stuck. So that's just one example of the kind of thing that you can do with a PhD in government. There are a number of different funding agencies where you can do things kind of like that. So DARPA, the National Science Foundation, the NSA has places like this. The NSA is also dual in that there are people in the NSA who actually do research themselves. Of course, they usually don't tell you about it. Then there are federally funded research and development centers like the Software Engineering Institute at CMU, Lincoln Labs, JPL. And then there are government research labs like AFRL, which is the Air Force Research Lab, the National Research Lab, the Department of E-Labs. I'm talking mostly from a US perspective here, but they're kind of analogies to these kinds of things in other countries as well. These jobs, some of them involve actually doing research yourself, kind of like in a research lab, except instead of working for a company, you're working for a government. Others are funding, giving money to other people, like my job at DARPA. So then all of the positions at DARPA are 3-year term appointments. So after that 3 years was up, I actually went to Tufts, where they had given me tenure several years before. So I'm not going to talk in the interest of time about what a tenure track job is like. There are, like, if you want to ever be an associate dean, a dean, or a provost, you actually have to have a PhD. So that's part of the path into getting to academic leadership positions. There are also teaching track positions where instead of focusing on research and teaching and service, you're just focused on teaching. Teaching loads here are typically 4, 5, or 6 courses, maybe sometimes 7 or 8 courses a semester, usually on the lower side on computer science. In computer science right now, super high demand. Like every university is trying to hire these people. So it's pretty easy to get a job as a teaching track professor. You do have to prove that you can teach well. Salaries are going up as a result of the demand, so that currently salaries for teaching track professors are on par with or only a little bit lower than salaries for research tenure track professors. Typically, they have 3 to 5 year contracts. Initially, your contract is probably 2 years, but after that first year review, you can get 3 and then up to 5 years. And the country is talking about going to rolling contracts so that you could always have some number of years in the future so that you would have a lot of job security even if you didn't have tenure. You don't have the full rights and responsibilities of tenure. So it produces a little bit of a caste system, and some departments are better than others at minimizing the difference between them. But so if you're somebody who is super ambitious and cares that you're not the top kind of dog, then don't do this. But if that's oblivious, if you don't care about that, this can be a really great kind of job opportunity. And then kind of analogous is the research-only track, where you don't have any teaching responsibilities, you just have research responsibilities. These are funded off of grants, or so-called soft money. So if the funding situation goes away, these positions can go away. And you also don't have the full rights and responsibilities of a tenure track professor. So again, it's a little bit of a second-class citizenship. So basically, there are a lot of choices. The kind of what I was trying to convey here is there's a lot of choices. They have different trade-offs. You should think about what you like to do and what is the best match for you. And then most of these positions, it's pretty easy to change from one to the other, except tenure track positions. It's very, very hard to change into a tenure track position. You can go from a tenure track position to many, many other things. But if you don't have that ongoing publication record, you can't really switch on to tenure track. So if tenure track is something that you might possibly be interested in, do it first and then change to something else, or be really strategic. Like I was paying a lot of attention to figure out how I could switch to the tenure track position. And with that, I will take questions for a very short period of time. Yes. Yeah, so one was like the PC bust, and the other was the .com bust. I personally, so one was in 94, 95, and one was in 2004, 2005, something like that. I can't remember. One was the PC bust, one was the .com bust. I personally don't anticipate something like that happening again because the demand for computer science at this point is not narrowly focused in Silicon Valley, but is broadly based across like the whole world and every kind of sector. So it's not just tech companies that are trying to hire computer scientists right now. It's everybody who's trying to hire computer scientists, and that leads to vast increases in students in universities, which means all universities are trying. All universities trying to increase will eventually stop. But I think that we're really low on the amount of people we need long term. Like we're an order of magnitude smaller than biology, right? So I think there's a lot of room before we'll reach that. So I wouldn't stress about that anytime in the near future.
Also, the 0405 bus was smaller, right?
Yeah, and this is there's this myth that the cycles were like this, like we go back to the same bottom line, but in fact they were like this, right? So every time it crashed, it didn't go back quite as far. So it's actually been increasing all along. It's just increasing with a pretty big wave amplitude on top.
Actually, Kathleen, a follow-up question to that.
Yeah.
About how many tenure track computer science faculty positions go unfilled each year?
A lot.
Yeah, it's like 100.
Yeah, like there were 100 positions, 100 tenure track positions that went unfilled last year, and I would take a guess that probably the same number of teaching track positions went unfilled last year. So at SIGSE is an annual conference of computer science educators, which has both people who are doing research and people who are teaching, but it's a primary meeting space for people who are focused on teaching. And they were talking about hiring practices and what you could expect as a teaching track professor. And there was a room of about 100 people, and somebody asked, how many of your institutions are looking to hire a teaching track professor this year? Every single person in the room raised their hand. And then they asked, how many of you are looking for a job? And nobody was looking for a job. Yeah.
Do you know what the percentage of Tufts undergraduates who are CS majors?
It's the largest major on campus. Yeah, so we've had a 6.5-fold increase in the number of undergraduates. So we went from having 30 majors a year to having 160 majors a year in a 6.5-year time period. This is why everybody's hiring like crazy, because that's insane, right?
And I know that at Princeton, 1/4 of the undergrads are CS majors.
Right, yeah. In Stanford, it's the most common major. Many, many places, it's had a huge increase. Yep. Being in industry? Yeah, so it's important that, teaching the very first time you teach is overwhelming no matter when and where you do it. So making sure, and then the second time is a lot of work, and then the third time it's this takes almost no time. Being strategic about when that, oh my God, this takes over my life term happens, and being upfront with your employer that is going to happen. Usually employers do that because they really want to retain you, and so they're okay with that. And it's not all your time. There's enough to... My experience of being in a research lab is actually there's a lot of spare capacity. University job much more fills all of the time that you're willing to give it. Whereas a research lab, there's a lot more spare. Like when I was at a research lab, and whenever anybody asked me to do a service thing, I always kind of felt like I just should say yes, because like the amount of things I have to do in the research lab is almost zero compared to the people who are working in academia who have to do the teaching and the service and the research. So it's not that hard, basically, to balance that. Jeremy. Yeah.
It's not clear to me that is replicated across the world. The US is quite special.
Right, well, I mean, different countries have, like, so yeah, definitely, if you're interested, you should think about your specific country and talk to people who are in senior positions in your particular country. I mean, in Australia, there's the Data 61 research lab. In France, there's INRIA. So, what it is in each country varies, and it's not the case that every single country has every single variant. The US has a very rich ecosystem of different kinds of positions, but these are the kinds of things that you might look for. Like the equivalent of NSA exists in England, right? GCHQ. Right. Any last question while he's getting set up? Yes.
Which was your favorite job?
Oh. I'm going to give you the cop-out answer, right? I actually have liked all of them. They're interesting in really different ways, right? Like DARPA was really cool for the impact of that 3-year period, but you can't really do that over and over and over again. I liked the calmness of AT&T and I love the excitement and energy of academia and getting to work with students and so like when I went to AT&T, I kind of thought like, oh good, I only have to do one thing at a time. And then like one of the things at a research lab is you have a lot of choice about how you do your job as a research lab. You can be very much single-minded, or you can do lots of different things. And over time, I basically took on, like I made my job at a research lab be kind of like what it would be at a university with supervising students and teaching classes and doing a massive amount of service. So I kind of like that frenetic energy. Yeah, one of these days I'm going to get tired and then like something else will happen. But they're all good in different ways.